All right. Well, as people start to trickle in, we're going to get started in just a few minutes here. So just grab a cup of coffee or water or whatever you need and chill out for a moment. Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting a few minutes here. I feel like these beginnings are always so awkward because it's like some people have heard what you said before and other people haven't, and we're all just sort of waiting for everyone else to show up, and you never really know when you should get started as well. But everyone who's coming in and joining now, we'll get started in a few minutes here. We'll just let everyone trickle in. And thanks, James, for joining, and thanks everyone for joining. Actually, this is the good sort of exercise that I like to do. If you are dialing in from somewhere, which I assume everyone is, why don't you go ahead and chime in with where you are dialing in from? So it's kind of cool to see where people are coming from. For those of you just joining, welcome. We're gonna get started in a minute or so. But why don't you go ahead and chime in the chat where you're dialing in from? Cool. Oh, great. All right, so we have quite the crowd. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure more people will join in the next couple of minutes or so. But I am super excited for this AMA. We have the great opportunity to chat with David Hauser, who is not only a super successful entrepreneur in his own right, but also a longtime mentor and friend of mine. I just always learn so much from David. So even if nobody else gets anything out of this, I certainly will. And you know, he just really has great advice about business and life in general. And I think this is such a great opportunity for everyone to ask questions. So the format for this AMA, before I introduce him, is that you can just go ahead and use the chat as you are right now, and I will pull out questions to ask on your behalf. and you can go ahead and chime in with questions at any point in time. But I'll probably kick off the webinar with my own set of questions until we can really get going. I know that people tend to be shy. Don't be shy. Throw in your questions in the chat. So with that, we'll go ahead and I would love to introduce David Hauser. David Hauser is a longtime forever entrepreneur. He has had successful bootstrap companies. Grasshopper is probably one of his more notable companies, completely bootstrapped that, and we'll ask him questions about that story. And then that company was acquired by Citrix, and we'll talk about the M&A process as well. But in addition to Grasshopper, he has also many other businesses, which we may or may not have time to dive into today. But you can certainly feel free to ask him any questions that you want, and we'll dig right in. So David, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Elizabeth. It's good to see you, and I'm glad we could do this.
Yeah, likewise. So tell us actually a little bit about Grasshopper. Like, why did you decide to start that business, and what was sort of the beginnings of that?
Yeah, so it really came out of our own need, right? Like I was running small little things, side projects in high school and whatever, if it was web design or selling this or selling that. And every time ran into the same problem, like, I don't know how to get a phone to do what I wanted to do, right? Like it was either a cell phone or a house phone, my mom picking up the phone, whatever it was. And it wasn't a very professional image. And of course, PBXs had been around for a long time, but like, I didn't want to have to buy equipment and install it. And this was way before voice over IP or any of that. And it said, like, I just want to create this for myself. And built the original prototype, not very well, as I was told later, as we hired much smarter developers, and really built it for my own needs.
And then, but at what point did you think this was a business?
So we quickly realized that it was a business when we were selling more than we possibly could, right? So like we had this very rudimentary prototype that worked, right? But like there was no backend CRM, there was no interface on the web even, right? Like you could sign up online, but then you were just given a phone number and you had to set up stuff over the phone, like your recordings and whatever else. So like we built the absolute minimum and people just kept signing up. And the thing that was most interesting is our cost of acquisition was so low. And it's hard to compare to now, right? Like this was before Google AdWords. This was like Omniture days. So, CPCs were like cents, right? So we were definitely acquiring customers very attractively, and very quickly found like we needed to hire a customer service person because we couldn't handle it. So like that told us there was something there so that we could invest and actually build and create the things we needed, right?
So I think actually I want to hone in on something that you said. It sounds like in the very beginning days when people were coming to your site, it was not self-serve. You basically had to hop on a phone call with you guys to get this thing set up.
So it was self-serve, but they had to do it over the phone. Like they literally called the phone number, entered a PIN number, and said, press 1 to record your main greeting. Like it was very not well done. And in fairness, right, like when we started, we were also charging for once we had it for web access, right? So like the expectations were different than they are today, 20 years ago. But the idea was like we built the absolute minimum.
Mm-hmm. And remind us, what year was this, just so everyone can get some context?
2003, 2004.
Okay. So were you in school at that time, or were you doing this full time?
I was still at Babson. So that was my junior year when we started. So I was running it my senior year with employees in the office while I was still doing class 3 days a week, which was a little bit difficult. But yeah, I mean, it was that 2003 to 2004 year. I graduated 2004.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like it was sort of bootstrapped from the very beginning. Like, did you ever consider raising money, or did you try to, or?
Yeah, so we definitely had conversations much later on when the company was more mature from a fundraising perspective. But when we were starting, it wasn't even a thought process we had, right? Like we just assumed we were going to bootstrap it. Like there was no other thought or option. And that's probably why we just naturally built the minimum, because we had nothing to do. And then like when we were starting to buy equipment and do this stuff, like the bills were quite large, hundreds of thousands of dollars. we had like $200,000 that we kind of scraped together ourselves. That was really what we got going with. And the first set of servers we bought was more than that. So we had to get partners to believe in us. So they kind of funded us, right? They gave us payment terms. We sold them the story of what we were doing without them giving us money, but giving us payment terms. So it was a similar process.
So actually, let's hone in on that. Like, what was the arrangement with these partners?
I mean, some of them were very simple, like, hey, send us servers now, we'll pay you in 6 months. And, for them, it wasn't a big order. For us, it was a big order. So I think it was okay for them to do. They believed in the story, and it turned out well for them. We continued to buy from them for many years, right? And those became bigger and bigger orders as we built out bigger and bigger data centers ourselves. So I think it worked out well for them. On the other side, which is like the telecom side, like the minutes, the phone numbers, things like that, we kind of creatively negotiated terms and then negotiated for them to accept credit cards, right? So they don't typically want to do that, but they did. So not only did we generate a tremendous amount of points over 12 years doing that and paying very large bills, but also we extended the terms, between 30 and 60, 65 days, depending on when you place the charge, right? So like that gave us a lot of leadway where we created a positive cash cycle throughout the entire life cycle of the business, where always we were collecting before we paid for the underlying costs.
And I want to dig into all of this because I think these are great tactics that people can use even today, and especially today, and even if you do or don't have funding. So what did these partners need to see in order for you to successfully negotiate these? Were they looking at your numbers of customers? Like what was the pitch?
No, our pitch was all forward looking. Like it was all vision. Like this is what we believe. We're serving entrepreneurs. We are entrepreneurs ourselves. This is why this is important, right? Like now we might have mentioned, hey, in our first days, we got 100 customers, but like we were early on. So we didn't have solid traction to pitch them on. Like we were definitely a risk, right? Without question. Like we were buying millions of minutes in a pretty short period of time. And like it all goes through resellers, and like there's a lot of people who touch it. Everyone took risk in that scenario. So it was really about that vision pitch more than it was about traction.
Did any of those people either angel invest or invest as part of their corporate?
I don't know. I mean, we never had the conversation, so they might have, but we never even considered it, and they never mentioned it. Maybe it was a blind spot for us. Like maybe we should have had those conversations. I'm not sure, but it was never a topic. Like we didn't have fundraising conversations until we were doing probably $10 million a year in revenue.
Oh, wow. Okay. In those early days, how did you accept payments? I mean, did you have payment processing on your website even?
Yeah, it was 100% credit card.
Okay.
And we faced so many challenges with that. First, when you start ramping up quickly, credit card processors don't love that. So it's high risk to them. They didn't love telecom, again, high risk. Then we also had fraud problems and other things. So like we quickly learned we had to diversify processors. So we would have one processor for new signups, one processor for ongoing customers. So we would, because like they were holding at one point hundreds of thousands of dollars because of a fraud complaint, right? And it wasn't anything we did. It was a customer who stole a credit card, signed up, used a bunch of minutes, like all those things happen, right? And it got worse over time in terms of size, but we got better and better at detecting it and diversifying our processing. But it was all credit cards. I'm trying to I don't think we accepted anything but credit cards.
And when you were getting all these customers, was it through AdWords? You kind of alluded to how these prices were low. Well, like how did these customers find you?
Yeah, so definitely AdWords, like Omniture at the time, and then migrating to AdWords over time. We very quickly started building organic SEO. Like that was one of the things, one of our earliest investments outside of typical paid channels. So that's something that maintained throughout the whole life cycle of the company, and even today, right? Like if you look at the rank for Grasshopper, we outrank the Wikipedia page for Grasshopper, right? So like there was a lot of investment there. But we also very early on started testing other channels. Like, I don't know if you remember back in the 2000s, you could take out these little ads in the back of Entrepreneur Magazine and Forbes. They were
Yeah.
like little tiny squares, right? It was through some reseller who bought a full page and you paid or whatever. Like, I ran ads there that directed people to the website, and they actually did pretty well, right? Like,
Oh, wow. Okay.
direct people to the website or call a phone number. Those converted, right? So like we were always testing things like that.
So actually talk a little bit about this with regard to bootstrapping, because it sounds like you had expenses on the infrastructure side, but then of course there's always marketing expenses and trying all these things. Since you were entirely bootstrapped, how did you think about managing costs?
I mean, we did it very rudimentary at the beginning, like literally on a cash basis, like what can we afford to test? As we got more mature, obviously we got much better at understanding what that looked like, what LTV looked like, you know, what cash cycles were and things. But like initially it was all just what cash do we have? And what things can we delay so we can buy more customers
So
on a day-to-day basis, right?
it sounds like in the beginning you tried to basically defer costs, and it sounds like you didn't take much salary.
We didn't take any to start.
Okay. So everything you made, you poured back into the business.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Right. And like, it was a very unique time because like I had the benefit of still being in college.
Yep.
So, like, I didn't have necessarily typical expenses. I wasn't living on campus, but like that was already contemplated and paid for through other things I was doing. Right. So like, I didn't have a family. I didn't have additional expenses. I didn't care about what I was eating. Right. Like those things didn't matter. So it was a very unique time and situation that I had.
And your co-founder was in a similar situation?
Yeah, 1 year ahead of me.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And then if you are open to sharing your numbers, like, you know, what did that kind of look like? What did that trajectory of revenue look like, roughly speaking?
Yeah, so like in the first 12 months, we got to about $2 million ARR. And then, you know, pretty quickly ramped up from there, like 2 to 6 to 9, you know, somewhere just under 10, right? And then continued on that ramp. So not doubling every year, but quite aggressively. So at 9, I think we went to 15 or 16 the next year, then like 18, 20, and ultimately we're about $30 million a year when we sold the company.
Okay. This actually, by the way, just for everyone out there, is quite fast growth. There are very few companies I've seen that have gotten to even $1 million in the first year, let alone 2 million in the first year, just as a benchmark. And this is actually,
and I would note, like, I do think there was a very important factor of timing and luck there. Like, we were hitting a market that was having attention and growing. Like, we were riding a wave. VoIP hadn't started yet, but like Vonage was starting to come out, you know, as we like those things were being talked about. And then if you look at kind of the trajectory of new businesses and entrepreneurship, like that continued to accelerate through our time, right? Like, even though the economy was doing bad, more people were starting businesses. So like those things, it definitely accelerated our growth outside of the things we were doing.
And if folks have questions about this, the bootstrapping stage, et cetera, feel free to throw them into the chat. Oh, and it looks like Bo has one. So how did you think about hiring in the beginning, first year or two, especially since you didn't really have that much money?
Yeah, first of all, not intelligently. But I think that the thing that we did do well was every job me or my co-founder did ourselves before we hired someone. Even if it wasn't necessarily our expertise, like I am definitely not the best person for customer service on the phone with people. Like, it's not my personality, it's not what I'm good at. But I was the person that answered every call for 2 reasons. 1, we had no one. 2, the backend system didn't exist. So like you would call, and to find a customer, I was literally typing SQL statements into the database to see if you were a customer and find what information we had and whatever, right? So the first person we hired was a customer service rep that had to have SQL experience because we didn't have a app to look at stuff, right? So, but that continued. So like, even though I think our process for thinking about where we should strategically hire wasn't smart, we still did all of those jobs first. So we had a very unique knowledge and information about, like, forget job description. Like, we knew day to day what this person had to do, how much time it took, what things could be done better, like all of those pieces before we hired.
Along these lines, were you nervous about making your first hires in these first couple of years when you didn't have that much cash?
Very. So besides the fact, like, just the week to week payroll and things like that, it's also a commitment to hire someone, right? Like, we're asking someone to possibly leave another job. They most likely have a family. They were older than us, right? Like, we're making a real commitment to them that we took seriously. And like, that was very nerve-wracking, our first kind of 5 hires, until we really had a sense of like what was going on. But those first ones were very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Did you, to try to I think through cash flow management, did you ask folks to, I don't know, be paid more in commission or be paid more in stock or something like that?
No, we were very careful with stock and really didn't give any out. Maybe in the later years, some of the executive team, and we can talk about the exit and how that worked from an MA perspective, because almost none of the team really had equity. And we ended up actually attributing a significant amount to them that was outside of anything they had on paper, because it was the right thing to do. But no, the initial hires, like, we were just underpaying, quite honestly. Like, as we matured, we came to a much better place where we're like, let's overpay cash and underpay with zero equity, right? Like, unlike a funded company, we took it in a very different approach, and we paid people more cash. The initial days was very simple. We just paid people less than the market.
And what was the pitch to get great people with less cash?
I don't know if all the people were great. So that's maybe the first caveat. And like, we went through a reset once we probably got to about 15 or 20 people and said, like, there's a problem with the culture. We didn't spend enough time putting the core values visibly in place and talking about them. There's people that are a problem. And we had to transition that over a 12-month period, which was very painful for the whole company. But the initial people, I think we had 2 things. One, not all of them were great. Some of them were. 2, the economy wasn't great. If you think back to 2004, 5, 6, 7,
Sure.
We had a little bit of benefit of, kind of what we have today, which is, layoffs and other things happening where some great people are available and are willing to take a chance.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to Ashwin's question for a moment. So, how did you retain these people, the good ones? And I think actually to this point of, for some of the folks who were not good, like, at what point did you let them go? You still needed people to do these jobs. Like, how did you balance all of that?
Yeah, the great people we tried to really retain with the culture we built over time, right? So like, it's easy to have a pool table or whatever in the office, but that's not what kept people, right? Like, we tried to build a truly a place that people wanted to be and enjoyed being at, right? And there's lots of little things that go into that. There's bigger things, if that's the parties or the things we do as a group together to build community. So we spent a lot of time and money in that over the years, right? The most important piece of which, like, we spent a crazy amount of time talking about our core values and our culture, to the point where, like, I would test this when people came into the office, once this was really mature, and say, like, you can walk out into our office and ask any person our core values and core purpose, and I'll give you $1,000 if they don't know. I never paid out, not once, right? Like, so that was really ingrained in every process: hiring, firing, rewards, recognition, every piece of it. And it created a really great culture. On the inverse side of that, how did we deal with people that didn't fit? There were some that self-select out. They're like, this is uncomfortable. I don't fit here, because these guys are talking about this, the culture all the time. Everyone's living and breathing it. I don't fit. So they just self-select out. Those are the easy ones. The more difficult ones are the high performers with low cultural fit. Those ones we have to move out, because they will stay because they know they're high performers. And those are some of the most difficult ones to move out, because you're removing what could be a quote unquote 10x programmer, right? But you have to, right? And we had that instance many times.
I mean, this is what a lot of these, Googles of the world struggle with. How do you think about that? I mean, nobody is very cookie cutter of like, oh, well, they are, clearly mean or whatever, or, like everyone's got a gradient in their personality. How do you decide when someone is not a culture fit or not enough?
We looked at this on a quarterly basis in two ways. One, our kind of review process, which was quarterly. And I think that was too much. We actually backed off and went to biannual instead of quarterly. But we went all in on it, and it just was too much from a quarterly perspective. But every person, so their manager, themselves, and at least one peer was rating them on each of the core values. So there was a lot of overhead here, but the data and the stuff that came out of it was great. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is, as an executive team, we went through every person, including those on the executive team. Are you a A+, B, or C player, both in performance and cultural fit? And if you came up anything is under an A in 2 quarters, there was a conversation with you and your manager, right? And that's much more. That's kind of not as hard data. Hey, here are the 7 instances where David didn't do this or whatever. But your rating is a problem, and we have to have a deeper conversation about it. That was a good gut check.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to some of these earlier questions here. So Bo has a few, but one that I want to hone in on is what roles were critical in early growth? So you mentioned what you might have done differently or alluded to that. If you were to go back and rewind the clock in those first 2 years, what hires would you have made?
So it's hard for me to go back and look at things like that, because I always feel like it's part of the journey.
Sure.
Maybe we wouldn't have been as successful if we changed those. I would say the key learning was we did not quickly move out the responsibility for paid ads or paid marketing, right, as a channel. We retained that as founders longer than typically people, I think, would have advised.
Mm-hmm.
But we had a really close relationship with it and understood it and could drive results. And I think that's why when we hired later on, we were much smarter about hiring and understanding that we outgrew people through those stages. We had a great person in the kind of 10 to 20 range, but when we wanted to go from 20 to 50, it was a different person that we needed from a management perspective, from all of those things. And you can't always mature people, right? Mm-hmm. And that learning came from we knew when the position outgrew us, right? And it was just beyond what we could do, but we held on to that longer than I think we typically were told we should have.
Mm-hmm. And was there any point in this journey where you felt like you just, I don't know, didn't have enough cash to support your team?
Yeah, I mean, every day. Every week. I mean, every conversation was, I wish I had more people on my team. I wish I could spend more on this. Those conversations were consistent in every department, right? If it was engineering, if it was customer service, if it was marketing, it didn't matter. There was always that need being discussed. Now, I don't know how legitimate the need always was, right? I think it's an easy, knee-jerk reaction to say, I just need more people. So we challenged that pretty heavily. And maybe got more productivity because of it, because we had no other option. But it was a conversation every day, consistent.
Yeah, sure. From you started talking about how at some point culture became a big part of the conversation, but just so everyone has a sense, at what point did you think about values and culture and all of that? Was that in the first year or later?
It should have been in the first year. It was much later. My job significantly shifted from, I still had engineering and other people reporting to me, but my job when we were about $10 million or so in revenue significantly changed from, 90% of my time was spent on culture. So that was a huge shift from my personal time perspective, but also the focus of the company, right? That's when things started to shift significantly. I wish we did it much earlier. It wasn't important in my mind,
Yep.
I didn't understand it. I didn't understand the value of it. We were growing quick. So, sales hides everything, right? So like there was
Yep.
all sorts of bad things happening that we didn't want, and, stuff that could have been fixed and whatever. But like we went from 5 million to 10 million. Did it matter in our mind at the time? No, but you then hit those plateaus, right? And that's when you start to question.
Yeah. So when do you think startups should start thinking about this?
I think in the earliest days, right? Like I don't think that it's necessarily more important than having the initial prototype or going to market. I still believe the most important thing is to get paying customers right now, right? I don't care what they're paying for. I don't care if it's the product that actually is going to be the long-term product or not, but like someone to vote with their dollars, not some opinion survey or poll or whatever, like dollars in to say, I believe in you, what you are building, what you've built, whatever the question is, right? That's still the first, but I think the second is culture, and definitely before the first hire, right? Like if you've,
Oh,
if
wow,
you've
that
not,
early.
yeah, if you've not had a conversation either with yourself or co-founders about like, what are our core values? They don't have to be perfectly written, but like you should have them somewhere before that first hire.
Yeah, interesting. So what happened, I think one of the questions I often get asked by founders is, well, I met this person who has this great skill set, and I really desperately need that skill set. That person may or may not be the best fit or whatever. Would you make that hire and then try to deal with it later? Or would you just say, no, we're going to just work without this person and keep plodding on?
So I think that it's an important question, and it's even more powerful if you've already started to think about and put down on paper the values, because then it's a real conversation. You're like, look, I know Elizabeth does not fit these 2 of 4 values. I'm willing to accept that because today I need this skill set, I need access to networks, whatever it is. And I'm willing to knowingly go into this scenario and accept it, knowing what those things are, rather than like, maybe it doesn't feel perfect. I don't know why. That's a very soft conversation, right? And I think that then puts a timeline on it, which is, look, I know that I'm accepting this. I can decide how long I'm willing to accept it, and I know exactly what I'm accepting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say don't make the hire, right? Like there are times that you do, right? It just how it works.
Yeah. Yeah. And it actually is very common, I think, for a lot of early people to get transitioned out one way or the other, either self-selected or otherwise.
Yeah. And it's a hard thing to learn as a founder, right? Because like we want to have loyalty. We want to, bring people along on that journey, but sometimes the company outgrows an individual, and you can't always bring everyone along. That's just the reality.
Yeah. Pavan asks, what were the values of Grasshopper?
So you're gonna test me. So the values were, they spelled out Gary. Go above and beyond, always entrepreneurial, radically passionate in your team. So those were the core values. Our core purpose was empowering entrepreneurs to succeed, right? Like, so those were the things we talked about again and again and again from every process. And I think if you go back and talk to employees from before we sold the company, they will still tell you those core values, for 2 reasons. One, we consistently drilled it in, so it was hard to forget. But 2, we got better and better at hiring people that truly lived those values, right? Like in the hiring process, we said, like before we had a conversation about what's the skill set, what's the programming language, whatever it is, we said, write us 1 paragraph per value, how you live this in your work and personal life, right? Not just work life, but work and personal life. So like this was early on in the process, and these became very telling, like how someone wrote about these, if they were taking off the shelf, our words and just regurgitating them back, or giving examples, right? Of like, this is what I did when this happened.
Just let generative AI do the talking for you.
Yeah, we didn't have that problem.
Yeah. Catherine asked, did you end up offshoring any particular roles?
Yeah, so we had lots of challenges with this. Like our first kind of attempt to take programming out of my hands to others was all offshore. It was an absolute disaster. But we still delivered stuff, right? So like things were still being delivered. It was more painful than me doing it myself. The quality was terrible. We had to rewrite everything that was written. The problem there was not that it was offshored, but that we weren't managing it properly, right? Like we didn't understand the processes and systems that you had to have in place to manage offshore. And like I still have people doing work for me in Brazil and other places today, but that's managed totally differently than what we did at that time.
Mm-hmm. Were there other roles besides developer work that you offshored? No.
No. So interestingly, we kept all of our customer service in-house and in the US. So
Okay.
they were based in Florida. After the company was sold, they tried twice now to offshore this. Both times it's been brought back to the US. And I think there's a key factor for Grasshopper, which is people expect if you're providing a phone system or phone service that they can call and talk to someone. So the expectation is different than if I'm just providing an online app that I may be able to do chat, I may be able to do tickets, whatever. Like their expectation is they can call us. So we had to staff that in English, Spanish, and a few other languages, 24/7, 365, and have low wait times. Like typically call to answer was 4 to 5 rings.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And Ben asks regarding offshoring. So how did you hire these folks? Was it freelance contractors, full-timers overseas?
So initially we had no idea what we were doing. We used an agency, we hired some people in India. It was a terrible experience. As we matured over time and we started building out other things like Chargify and some other companies, we got much better at this, finding individual contractors in what, it doesn't matter really what country. That's when we went all in on remote pretty early. So this was 2010, roughly 2009, 2010, where we were starting a company that was 100% remote. Some people in the US, some people in Brazil. It was a mix of places. And we started building those processes for like, how do you run a remote company? We did quarterly meetups. We did all of those things pretty early on before this was even a conversation that was happening.
Were there people who did not survive the transition from in-person to remote?
Yeah, so Grasshopper we kept as we had an office.
Okay.
We probably made the worst decision, which was we then allowed this hybrid scenario where we had some people remote and some people in an office. I think it's the worst possible option. Either have everyone in an office or everyone remote. But the companies we started after that were all remote. So Chargify was 100% remote from day one. And like we were figuring out like, how do we have constant video communication? And we were using PlayStations because it was the only reliable platform to have video on all day. So we could work together and things like that. Because there was no Zoom like it exists today, like none of those things.
Yeah, yeah. Abhay, I'll get to your question about M&A in a second, but Alex wants to know, how did you think about prioritizing monetization versus usage, like just in general?
Yeah, so I'll take the word usage to kind of mean engagement, if that makes sense, right? So for us, monetization was always the most important, period, right? Like as a bootstrap company, it's the only thing we thought about, probably to a fault, right? Like if you look back at our feature set, like we didn't release text messaging to our customers until, I don't know, 5 or 6 years after Google Voice had it, right? Like we were very far behind, and it actually became many $1 million a year line item of business. So we probably missed that opportunity because it seemed expensive at the time, hard, compared to other things we could do to sell a little bit more of something or sell something else that cost us less to do. So we probably missed some revenue opportunity there. But the learning for us was like, we built a process that fixed that going forward. Like every feature came with a business case, right? Every feature came with a champion from marketing that said, here's how I'm going to sell this feature. here's where we think the P&L will come out here. Like all of those things started to get built up. So we could actually prioritize not just based on cost and monetization, but the combination of those to which is our best option for profitability moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a very different way of thinking than a lot of VC-backed businesses. No, but I think it's great, right? Because ultimately it's the business that matters. There are a number of questions about monetization, kind of pulling them all together. Can you talk a bit about your first $1 to $1 million ARR, let's just call it? Like, what are some lessons learned? You know, what do you recommend as like the kind of ways somebody can get on that path?
Yeah, so we went quickly through that, right? So like in the first 12 months, we were about 2 million. So that process and speed was quite fast. I think the key learning for me during that is like focus on nothing else other than selling, right? Like the software was terrible. The quality of it was garbage. Like I would not be proud of it at all. But like honestly, at the time, it wasn't even a consideration in my mind. It was not something that I was like, well, I'm not sure about this. I'm like, I don't care about this. All I care about is someone going to pay? How long are they going to pay? That's it, right? The second piece was very quickly we learned if we wanted to scale this company in this marketplace, micro SMB companies, right? So under 10 employees, word of mouth was tremendously important. And word of mouth did not mean that we provided the best like software or actual delivery of service. It meant that we provided the best experience, which is why we continue to invest in customer service, because like we screwed up 1,000 times, right? But our best champions were the ones that we screwed up on. They called us and we just did what was right? We gave them the wrong phone number. They printed the wrong phone number on business cards. Like this happened so many times. We gave them the right number. They printed the wrong one. We would refund them the full price of their printing.
Oh, wow.
Which was more than they paid us, right? But they became a customer forever and told everyone they knew, like Grasshopper is the greatest thing. And that had nothing to do with what we delivered to them, right? So ultimately 30% of our customers, even when we scaled, came from word of mouth because of those things, right? And I think that is one of the keys I think is most important in that $1 to $5 million, like whatever period of time that takes, you have to have champions out there that are yelling and screaming for you.
I mean, like day one, how did you know what customer acquisition channels to try? When did you know to kind of double down on Omniture versus something else? Like, how do you think about that experimentation process?
Yeah, we had no idea, so we just tried everything, right? And our goal was to try things as cheaply as possible from a small bet perspective, as quickly as possible. So like those were always the priority first, like small bets that we could get information quickly. Those bets grew over time, but the same process existed where it was still all about what is the size of the bet we can make for how long it takes to get the directional data. Outside of that, like we were not necessarily the most sophisticated from a measurement perspective in the early days. Like we were looking at the most simple metrics, like how many customers are we getting and the cost per customer. That was it. We weren't even looking at LTV, right? We were just looking at like, what is our initial payback? And if it is positive, can I invest more in that channel?
Yeah. So you were looking for immediate payback. And if that worked, you kept on plowing into that channel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess as a bootstrap company, you have to do that. You can't wait half a year for people to pay back.
Yeah. Yeah. We got more intelligent over that on time and all those things. But yeah, initially, dollar in, dollar out. Like, how could we find more channels like that?
I think the struggle that a lot of companies have, and maybe, you have some element of luck around the trend, but a struggle that people have is, well, I don't know if I'm trying the right keywords. And maybe if I just try this experiment a little bit longer with a different audience segment and different keywords, it'll work. Like, how do you know when to kind of throw in the towel on an experiment?
Yeah. So like we looked for things that were obvious, right? Like in general, I never found a channel that was like marginal that then became good. There's a caveat to that with radio advertising because that's kind of how the channel works, but it's known. Outside of that, like if it was marginal, it just never worked. Either it stayed marginal or it got even worse. But when it worked, it was very clear. It was like the payback was 2x or whatever it was. It wasn't like on the edge.
Yeah.
Those are the things that we looked for, which meant we had to do lots and lots of testing.
Yep. And I think just for this audience, that is also what I've seen with our most successful companies as well. Like the channel works pretty much immediately without any crazy optimization or anything.
Yeah. Right. And like optimization then helps you later on, right? Like, can I squeeze out some more dollars? Can I change LTV a little bit? Can I change, conversion from 1.2 to 1.3, 1.4, but you're not taking conversion from 1.2 to 7. Like it just isn't happening, right?
Yep. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the other side, the exit. So you said that you started entertaining this exit around 30 million a year. Tell us like why, why did you start thinking about it then, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so we actually didn't think about an exit at all. So we had these conversations all the time, kind of post $10 million of revenue. Like people would come to us all the time, raise money, do this, do that. And our answer was consistently no. And our answer became even more aggressively no over time. Like, if you're an analyst, don't even email me. Like our response was, have a partner contact me if you even want a response, right? Like that was just a canned response that went out. So got more aggressive in the no's, but still within that, partners reached out. We sat down in meetings and had conversations. And every time we got into that process, it didn't feel like the partnership we wanted. So we just kind of stopped. We're like, don't need the money right now. Don't feel like we have the right partner. So we're stopping conversations, right? And that happened, I don't know, a handful of times, right? If you then go back to, kind of the sale process, we had no intention of selling. And this is very important because of how we structured compensation. Like when I had compensation discussions with the executive team, with employees, I was very upfront and honest. Like, they're like, well, I want equity. I'm like, okay, I hear what you're saying. First of all, I don't think our equity is worth anything because we have no intention of selling the company. We're not raising capital. So if I give you equity, I don't think that we're having an honest conversation about the direction of this company. I hear what you're saying because you're supposed to ask for equity, but it's not actually valuable, right? So I had this conversation again and again, and that's why we paid more than market and such. So we're not entertaining an exit at all. Citrix comes to us by a friend of mine who they purchased his company, and they said, we want to have a conversation. So, okay, like whatever, similar space, we'll have a conversation. And it kind of matured over time from there, but we said no to them 3 times. The first time we had the conversation, they're like, well, we're thinking about this market. We're like, okay, cool, thanks, bye. Second conversation was, we definitely want to buy someone in this space. We said, okay, we hear you, thank you, but come back to us. We have a very clear plan for the next 4 quarters. Let's talk later. They came back in 2 quarters and said, you guys have exceeded all of your quarterly numbers you sent us. We've never seen that, and we've acquired 20 plus companies. We should have a deeper conversation. And then it matured from there.
So why were you so adamant against selling? Like a lot of entrepreneurs actually burn out when they do something for, you were what, in year 5 or 6 at this point?
No, 12.
Oh, year 12. Okay. So a lot of people want to perhaps do something else in year 12 or, get some money and feel like at this point I deserve it and I built a great business. Like why were you so adamant against this sort of thing?
So one, it just wasn't in our frame of mind, right? Like we just were not thinking about it. Maybe that wasn't smart, or I don't know, but like it wasn't something that we considered. We said, we're building a company where we want to be and we love. Like that was our goal. And one of our best alignments from a co-founder perspective, like we had lots of disagreements. We actually have very different skill sets that we found out were complementary. We knew none of this going in. We were not friends. We did not vet this out. Like it could have been a disaster. We got very lucky, but we were highly aligned on the most important thing, which is what is our end goal? And our end goal was to build something we loved. That was it, right? And from a money perspective, like we both lived comfortably. I had the house I wanted. It wasn't a fancy house. I had the car I wanted. It was a nice car. Like I didn't really need anything else. So I could have stayed on that path indefinitely, like without question. So there was also not a need for like significantly more money or capital. so it was easy to say no, right? It just, we loved it. Like I could have kept doing what we were doing for the next 10 or 20 years easily.
Well, okay, let's hone in on this, because you didn't come into this company deliberately plotting out, like, even, I don't know, even your co-founder to some extent, but also like the path that you're going to take, et cetera. How did you kind of fix all of these things within the company to set up a company that you knew you wanted to be at for decades?
It was just process over time. And it was the best, like that was the most exciting and fun part, was that process, that change over time, relearning and understanding what culture meant, like digging into those things. Like my most important thing today, right? I have more money than I could ever need. And I don't really care about that. What I care about is learning, right? Like, and I think we've had this conversation before, like I will do things that are probably negative to my cash flow, negative to my time, whatever else, if I know that I'm learning. So as that process continued, I was getting tremendous value and return from that, even if I didn't necessarily understand or, vocalize it at the time. So the learning, but then when we really got into it, like past year 5, and we had these values, like I spent a lot of time talking about like the reason we do this is empowering entrepreneurs to succeed. It has nothing to do with a phone system. I love getting on a call and having a conversation with entrepreneurs. And if I can get paid to do that, why would I ever stop? Right? Like I had hundreds or thousands of conversations. Every city I went to on a meeting, we would have a meetup. Like I'm not even a social person, but I loved those things because I could deliver value back to a community I loved.
Mm-hmm. You had your why. It wasn't just selling phone systems. You had a purpose for doing this.
Yeah, like I don't think I ever even talked about phone systems after year 5, right? Like you look at, like I did tons of interviews, all sorts of things, never even talked about what Grasshopper did because it wasn't important. And it's not that I didn't care about it. Like I cared deeply about the thing we were doing, but I cared about why much more.
Mm-hmm. So then what led you to sell ultimately? Like you're in these conversations with Citrix. Okay.
I mean, look, people ask this all the time and they're like, how do I know when to sell? And I think the easiest equation I've come up with is if someone is willing to pay you significantly more than what you think the value is, if you were on the buy side today, you have to consider it, right? Because you have near perfect information, right? Like there is no one else in the world that knows the problems in your company than you,
Sure.
right? So you're probably the most critical buyer possible. And if someone's willing to significantly outpay that, it's a conversation to be had, right? And when we sat down and looked at it, like there were lots of things going great. There were also lots of problems. We were struggling with engineering and putting product out that we wanted to put out. We were struggling with, from a cash perspective, being able to do bigger and bigger marketing buys, $12 million in radio, right? Like those are things that are hard and became more and more stressful. And while we were generating profit, obviously, they were willing to pay what we believed to be a significant multiple higher than where we thought it was worth.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there are all kinds of things to negotiate in an acquisition. First off, did you shop this around?
So no.
Oh no.
we did not. And I have very contrary beliefs here. I actually think that a lot of times it's not necessarily useful to shop a deal. Like we obviously hear all the times that it happens. Cisco and Microsoft are bidding and it goes up from $1 million to $1 billion because of the bidding. Like we hear those stories. It's actually not the typical case, right? Like if you look at the world of M&A, right, there's not all of these competitive environments. And two, like we were very focused on finding the right partner, and finding the right partner meant more than just the dollars that we got. What did it mean for the team, right? Like, are they going to just fire everyone and suck this company up? Are they going to keep the brand that we spent a lot of time and energy and love building, right? Like, what was the future of the company going to look like? Where when you shop that deal, you can't have those parameters because it's just dollars at that point, right? So we took an alternate path and said, we're going to hire a bank to represent us at a much, much lower rate than typical, to to only advise us on like, how do we extract the most value from this buyer in conversations, and how do we keep a deal on track? And I learned a tremendous amount through that process. So I'm happy we paid that person for what we got from them.
I mean, I guess in your case, your best alternative was just continuing to run the company.
Yeah.
For many other people, they've already decided they're going to sell, in which case they need an alternative. But what were some of the tidbits that the bank advised you on with regard to this?
Yeah, so the first one that became very clear to us days after the completion of the acquisition is every conversation that you have is a go or no go conversation. It may not seem like it, but every email, every phone call is exactly that, right? And they said that early on in the process. I'm like, yeah, whatever. But 3 weeks after we closed the acquisition, there was an activist investor in Citrix that forced them to dump their entire SaaS division, right? So we were 3 weeks away from the acquisition not happening, right? And obviously, I don't know the internal conversations, but they must have been having conversations with this activist investor before it was public, right? So it could have been days away, right? So each of those steps in the process is very important to just get to the next step for completion. From a negotiation standpoint, one of the most important learnings was there's important things to negotiate in the legal contract, and there's things that are not important, and you have to prioritize those that are. And a lot of people prioritize things they think are important because they have a bad advisor or whatever's happening. And what happens is you lose all your negotiating capital, because at some point in every deal, both sides are like, I'm done. Like, where the PSA is where it's at, right? And you don't want to get stuck with important things that haven't been solved, right? And like, now being on the buy side, I've seen this so many times. I'm like, guys, we've had so many dumb conversations. I'm just done. I'm walking or you're accepting. That's it, right? And that was an interesting learning to see now from both sides.
Mm-hmm. What about like the terms of it? Like, I don't know, cash versus stock versus handcuffs, how long you all have to be there, who's going over, all those things. Were those a lot of conversations that you had?
So there were conversations we had. They were not a lot of change, right? So one, the deal was all cash from the beginning. The deal had us as founders not staying from the beginning because we sold on, hey, this executive team is fantastic. You don't need us. So they actually paid more because they didn't have to find expensive titled positions for us to make us feel good. They're like, you guys can just go away. So it was a benefit to them. There was conversation around escrow, right? Like, this is an important topic. The escrow percentage or amount did not change from a kind of LOI to completion, but there was a significant carve out of additional escrow that was related to very specific things in the deal for federal telecom taxes and compliance and such that we didn't understand going in. It was fine in the end. It all paid out. It's no problem. But like, that was a deal point, kind of how that escrow worked, tipping baskets, all those things that kind of go into it. The rest of it, there was some negotiation around for the team, how we retain the team over time. And some of them had golden handcuffs and they had RSUs in a public company and the things you would expect to see to retain people over 2 or 3 years. And we had to get the team comfortable with that because we weren't staying, right? So like, we had to get them on board with that.
How did you, especially since you had 3 main conversations with Citrix, 2 times you turned them down, how did you, I don't know, manage the team? I assume you roped some people in to have discussions with them, but then when the deal didn't go through, that affects morale. Like, how do you handle all of that?
So luckily we didn't have the scenario where the deal didn't go through and we had to figure out what to do after, but it was definitely on our mind and a risk. So our initial conversations were very limited. The first 2 times we talked with Citrix was me, co-founder, 2 people on the executive team. And it wasn't atypical. Like, we had lots of these conversations, so I wasn't worried there.